The shadows of the Somme. The distant roar of artillery echoed through the labyrinth of tunnels, shaking the walls and unsettling the soldiers huddled within. Edward wiped sweat from his brow as he led his men deeper into the oppressive darkness, hoping to find a way out. The air was thick with dust and the scent of damp earth, making it difficult to breathe and even harder to think clearly. Hermann listened intently for any sign of movement, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. The tunnel walls felt as though they were closing in, amplifying the sense of claustrophobia among the soldiers. Clara tended to a wounded comrade, her hands trembling as she tried to focus on the task at hand. The muffled sounds of battle above served as a grim reminder of the war that raged on just overhead. Hans, his face lined with exhaustion, leaned against the cold stone, contemplating the futility of their situation. A flickering lantern cast eerie shadows on the tunnel walls, creating the illusion of movement in the corner of Edward's eye. The soldiers, both British and German, eyed each other warily, unsure whether to view one another as enemies or allies. The ground trembled with the force of another explosion, sending a shower of dirt cascading from the tunnel ceiling. Edward knew they had to keep moving, but every step felt like a struggle against the weight of the earth above them. Hermann tightened his grip on his rifle, though he knew it would be of little use in the confined space. Clara's soft voice broke the silence as she whispered words of comfort to the injured man, her own fears kept at bay. Hans couldn't shake the feeling that the war had already consumed them, even as they fought to survive. The tunnel seemed endless, a twisting maze with no clear path to safety or salvation. Edward's thoughts drifted to his family back home, wondering if he'd ever see them again. Hermann caught sight of a faint light in the distance, sparking a glimmer of hope within him. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden cough from the injured soldier, reminding her of the fragility of life. Hans felt a pang of guilt as he thought of the men he'd led into battle, now reduced to shadows in the dark. The flickering lantern began to dim, casting the tunnel into an even deeper gloom. Edward fought the rising panic in his chest, knowing that they couldn't afford to lose their only source of light. Hermann urged the group forward, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that gnawed at him. Clara silently prayed for the strength to keep going, even as her body ached from exhaustion. Hans closed his eyes briefly, seeking solace in the darkness before reopening them to the harsh reality. The tunnel grew narrower, forcing the soldiers to crouch as they made their way through the tight passage. Edward felt the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders, knowing that his men looked to him for guidance. Hermann's mind raced with thoughts of escape, though each option seemed more impossible than the last. Clara's fingers brushed against the cold stone walls, grounding her in the present moment as her mind wandered. Hans wondered how much longer they could last, with food and water running dangerously low. The distant sound of voices reached their ears, causing the group to freeze in place. Edward strained to listen, hoping to discern whether the voices belonged to friend or foe. Hermann motioned for silence, his eyes narrowing as he tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, the fear of discovery mingling with a flicker of hope for rescue. Hans gripped his pistol tightly, ready to defend himself if necessary, despite the growing despair in his heart. The voices grew louder, and the group realized they were not alone in the tunnels. Edward exchanged a tense glance with Hermann, both men understanding the gravity of the situation. The dim light revealed the silhouettes of approaching figures, their identities still a mystery. Hermann stepped forward cautiously, hoping to make contact without triggering a violent confrontation. Clara held her breath, her hand hovering over the wounded soldier as she waited for what would come next. Hans felt a surge of adrenaline as he prepared for the worst, though a small part of him longed for peace. The figures emerged from the shadows, revealing themselves to be another group of soldiers, just as lost and desperate. Edward lowered his weapon slowly, recognizing the fear and exhaustion in their eyes mirrored his own. Hermann and Hans exchanged looks of mutual understanding, their animosity tempered by shared hardship. Clara felt a wave of relief, though the tension in the air remained palpable, fragile as glass. The two groups stood in silence, the weight of the war hanging heavy between them like a physical presence. Edward took a deep breath and extended his hand to the leader of the other group, bridging the gap between them. Hermann followed suit, the gesture a silent acknowledgement of their common humanity despite the war. Clara stepped forward, offering what little supplies they had left to the other group's medic. Hans nodded his approval, knowing that in this moment, survival outweighed all else, even the war. The soldiers settled into an uneasy truce, sharing the small space in a fragile semblance of peace. Edward's thoughts returned to the surface, wondering if the war above had any meaning after what they'd experienced below. Hermann couldn't help but question the orders that had led them into this hellish underground maze. Clara found solace in the small acts of kindness exchanged between the two groups, a light in the darkness. Hans reflected on the nature of war, realizing that the true enemy wasn't the men before him, but the conflict itself. The tunnel seemed less oppressive now, the shared understanding between the soldiers easing the burden of their situation. Edward knew that they would eventually find their way out, though the journey would leave them forever changed. Hermann felt a flicker of hope, believing that perhaps, even in war, there was room for humanity to prevail. As the rescue team finally broke through the tunnel walls, the soldiers emerged into the light, carrying with them a newfound sense of purpose.